and Tobago. Mr. Dion Abdul, Chair, Trinidad and Tobago Transparency Institute. Mr. Martin Farrell, Vice Chair of the Trinidad and Tobago Transparency Institute. The Honorable Faris Alwari, Attorney General and Minister of Legal Affairs, who is our feature speaker this morning. Her Excellency Harriet Cross, British High Commissioner, other members of the Diplomatic Corps, officials of the Public Service, Mr. Munina Lalchan, Chairman, Procurement Regulator at the Office of Procurement Regulation, Mr. David West, Chairman of the Police Complaints Authority, representatives of civil society organizations, former chairs of TTTI, members of the Board of Directors of TTTI, other specially invited guests, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to the launch of the 2021 Corruption Perception Index, the theme of which is corruption, human rights, and democracy. Since the first launch in 1995, the CPI has become the leading indicator of public sector corruption. For 2029, the CPI ranks 80 countries. For 2021, the CPI ranks 180 countries on the basis of perceived public corruption with scores from 100 to 0, with the highest score of 100 being the least corrupt. Since 2012, the score of Trinidad and Tobago has ranged from a high of 41 in 2018 to a low of 35 for 2016. The CPI draws on data sources from independent institutions specializing in governance and business climate. Sources look at mechanisms available to prevent corruption in a country, such as its government's ability to enforce integrity mechanisms, effective laws on financial disclosure, conflict of interest prevention, access to information, the effective prosecution of corrupt officials, and red tape and excessive bureaucracy. For several years now, Trinidad and Tobago Transparency Institute has urged that 3 key elements for reducing corruption in Trinidad and Tobago are the full operationalization of the public procurement regime, legislation to regulate political party funding and campaign financing, and whistleblower protection legislation. Progress on these has been disappointingly slow. The procurement regulations are still to be approved by Parliament. The legislation in respect of campaign financing, which had lapsed as a result of the prorogation of Parliament for the 2020 general elections, is again before a joint select committee of Parliament. And the whistleblower protection legislation, which previously did not receive the support of the opposition, is still to be reintroduced. In analyzing CPI's rankings, Transparency International has found that countries which violate civil liberties consistently score lower on the CPI. It is of the view that complacency in fighting corruption exacerbates human rights abuses and undermines democracy, and that as rights and freedoms erode and democracy declines, authoritarianism can step in, contributing to even higher levels of corruption. In analyzing the 2021 CPI, the chair of Transparency International, Delia Ferreira Rubio, has lamented that the countries of the Americas are at a complete standstill in the fight against corruption. As corrupt leaders go, other activists and as corrupt leaders go after activists and consolidate power, the rights of the press, freedom of expression, and freedom of association are under attack. And she has called for decisive action to reverse this trend, protect civil society, and defend human rights and democracy. The countries of the Americas have attained an average CPI score of 43 out of 100 for the third consecutive year. This CPI, the Americas include 22 countries that show no statistically significant changes in their corruption levels. Despite extensive legislation and a regional commitment to control it, corruption in the Americas continues to undermine democracy and human rights. It is now my pleasure and honor to introduce the Honorable Faris Alwari, Attorney General and Minister of Legal Affairs, our keynote speaker this morning. Mr. Alwari was appointed as the Attorney General and Minister of Legal Affairs on the 19th of September, 2015. He first entered the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago in June 2010 as an opposition senator and served as a public relations officer of the People's National Movement for 2 consecutive terms. Prior to his appointment as Attorney General and Minister of Legal Affairs, he was heavily involved in areas of corporate commercial law, civil litigation, industrial relations, intellectual property, mortgaging, and conveyancing law and securities. Mr. Alwari was admitted to practice law in Trinidad and Tobago in 1996. He holds a Bachelor of Laws with honors from the University of the West Indies and a Master's of Law in Intellectual Property, Information Technology, and Alternate Dispute Resolution from King's College London, University of London. He also holds a Certificate of Legal Education from the Hugh Wooding Law School. Mr. Alwari speaks several languages and is a very strong supporter of various charities, in particular the Scout Movement and the Trinidad and Tobago Karate Association, of which he is a member and past instructor. To date, Attorney General Alwari has debated over 90 bills in the House of Representatives from 2015 to the present, that range from the most recent, the Interception of Communications Amendment Bill 2020, to the Whistleblower Protection Bill 2015. Mr. Alwari will deliver his address by pre-recorded video, as last afternoon he was informed of a Joint Select Committee obligation. Mr. Alwari.
Good morning, everyone. It gives me great pleasure to accept this invitation, most humbly, offered to speak at the launch of the CPI Index for Trinidad and Tobago this year. It's no gainsaying that Trinidad and Tobago is crying out on a continuous basis for a better quality of life and for a better standard. It is true to say that corruption stands as a cancer in any society. That cancer takes hard-earned, honest people's money into the dark corridors of shady business, which leads to jeopardy, which can find itself in human trafficking, which can find itself in murder. After all, one thing moves to the other. The government in 2015 was very pleased to launch its Follow the Money campaign. And in 2015, we stood on the CPI index at 35. Of Of course, the lower your number, the higher the perception of corruption. Last year we stood at 40. And whilst there has been some progress made, ultimately, significant process really has to be measured against not only the perception of corruption, but also to the realities of how people have faith in hard facts that corruption is being tackled. So back in 2015, we were faced with the position saying the system does not work. When most people ask the genuine question, well, okay, what is the system? We at the Attorney General's office decided that we would identify the system. Because after all, you can't expect a product to be produced if a system is not known in its constituent parts. We went into and we engaged in significant reform, which involved, first of all, treating with the place where justice is delivered. Secondly, treating with the people who deliver justice. Thirdly, treating with the processes that are involved in justice. And then fourthly, ensuring that all of this was operationalized in a way where people felt a genuine sense of being in a better position. In this regard, we're very pleased to say that the system has been radically reformed. And that system involves a move in legislation from 36 judges to 64 judges, an increase in magisterial immunity, having full protection for magistrates, simplifying magistrates' districts instead of 14 magistrates' districts having 3, North, South, and Tobago. Looking at the caseload, ensuring that 146,000 magisterial cases were not being dealt with by 43 magistrates, and instead working our way down to 20,000 being dealt with by 43 magistrates by decriminalizing motor vehicle and road traffic, decriminalizing marijuana and cannabis matters, moving preliminary inquiries as we will imminently out of the system and into a different form of treatment. All of that is well and good, but what we can say that the perception of corruption has to be dealt with in the system delivering justice. And today, as we have judge-only trials, including judge-only trials for murder, watching an 18-year-old matter be dealt with in 15 minutes flat in a judge-only context, having a verdict of guilt for murder being delivered in a couple of matters with no appeal on conviction, watching the birth of the Public Defenders Division, where competent counsel is provided for people who don't have, watching the systemization of justice become digital, watching virtual courts, watching the operation of electronic filing of evidence, watching the fact that someone can give evidence on a cell phone from the back of a cab in a truck at a pit stop in the United States of America, as happened in the Sean Luke trial, watching all of those things happen, we can definitely vouch that the system is radically different today than it was in 2015. Criminal proceedings rules, family and children division, criminal division itself, civil reform in terms of its division and rules of court, etc., as we go to probate reform and small claims reform. So let's put the position of the system aside. Tackling the perception of corruption, I'm certain, involves following the money and birthing and putting into effect the civil asset explain your wealth legislation as we await 2 critical judgments from the High Court, having gone to the Court of Appeal, on explain your wealth orders that have been made in this country. The civil asset explain your wealth legislation works in dealing with the perception of corruption. Having ensured that we can follow the money by knowing every company that is on the register, or land that is vested in Trinidad and Tobago, with a radical transformation of the land management system by bringing to life the property, business, real estate solution, so that with the click of a button, the Financial Investigation Branch, the FIU of Trinidad and Tobago, the Securities Exchange, the Trinidad and Tobago Fraud Squad, all of these entities now have instantaneous access to the data of Trinidad and Tobago. That did not exist in 2015 when we stood at 35 on the CPI and as we stand at 40 in a better place today. But, ladies and gentlemen, operationalizing the public procurement legislation, as we've just done the 12 regulations to make that come to life, that is only as good as campaign finance reform, which is completed in terms of a bill having been laid in the Parliament, referred to Joint Select Committee, and will be completed with a passage of special majority considerations not being necessary on a simple majority basis. We can treat with the sister product, the public procurement, campaign finance reform, standing alongside public procurement. Let's put it into a nutshell. If you can follow the money in cash, as we did with the demonetization of the $100 note, if you can follow the money in cash by financial obligations where you have to explain over $5,000 in terms of declarations at customs, etc. If you follow the money in know your customer in cash, as we have in the obligation and requirements at the banking sector, you're treating with cash and money. If you can follow the money in land, as we have done with the radical transformation via the launched and already operating PBRS system, the Property Business Real Estate Solution, you're tracking land where proceeds of crime may be found. If you're tracking companies and business entities by having already operationalized the beneficial ownership registers across non-profit organizations, across companies limited by liability, across further amendments that we're going to take into business arrangements and partnerships, then you are dealing with the true people behind transactions. Isn't that what the Panama Papers taught us? Isn't that what so many exposés have taught us? You need to know what and who stands behind cash, land, and businesses. Fortunately for us in Trinidad and Tobago, this is not to come, this has already been achieved. What will take us from 40 to 100 or into the 80s will be to see the judiciary deliver by way of judgments the many thousands of matters that the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service have brought to the fore. And I'm very pleased to say that the Backlog Management Committee, chaired by the Chief Justice, will be making public announcements soon as we go into revealing the preparedness for trials in specialist courts. You see, that's why we brought the criminal division to life, where specialist courts can happen. At present, the judiciary is opening the civil courts at the waterfront, the jury courts at the O'Meara campus, and I'd like to remind you, today in 2022, every judicial officer, magistrate, registrar, master, judge of the High Court, judge of the Appeal Court, they are all courtrooms by themselves, because we now turn on a computer in a virtual environment and have access to all of these courtrooms on a laptop, where a prisoner appears from the prison, where a defendant can appear in a virtual access center, where the attorney is at office or at home, where the judge is in chambers or at home. This did not exist in Trinidad and Tobago before this government came to the fore and before this Attorney General drove these reforms. So, my fervent hope is to be met with the reality that this can be done, because we have treated with plant and machinery, people, processes, and the law. My fervent hope is that as we drop case loads and we have more important matters in the central focus of the courts, with defenders, with prosecutors, with witnesses, because remember, we have done significant amendments to the Evidence Act. As we digitize the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service alongside the DPP's office, so that the National Prosecution Agency, which we are working on, becomes real. The perception of corruption is met with by the reality of action that leads to a conviction or an acquittal, so that justice is not only seen to be done, or expected to be done, but is in fact done. I would like to mention my concern in relation to the need for a better rapport between assessors such as Transparency International and the entity of the government. As Trinidad and Tobago's representative engaged in the discussions with the Financial Action Task Force, engaged in discussions with the Minister of Finance at the Global Forum and the European Union, the European Council, in the OECD and the OECS arrangements for transparency and treating with crimes, including tax evasion, it is important for us to know what is being assessed and by whom. After all, natural justice requires that you at least have the opportunity to say what you are doing. I'm convinced that with the short time that I've been given this morning, you are hearing things that will certainly pique your interest. I ask you to test the data. You can find everything that I'm saying in living reality, but surely it would be a by far more profitable enterprise for us to be able to be assessed with transparency. If you look at the Financial Action Task Force and their rave reviews of Trinidad and Tobago, as in January 2020 we satisfied them that the country is on the right path, I'd like to make that call to the Transparency International Group, its local chapter, to engage in cards on the table, face up. May I, in conclusion, express my profound gratitude to your very hard-working chairman, Dion Abdul. He has been a stalwart champion for Transparency International and can speak with certainty as to perspective and opportunity. To you, Dion Abdul, I certainly salute your effort and your enterprise in having discharged your duties so consistently at the Transparency International Trinidad and Tobago chapter. We look forward to the perception index that is to be released today, and we certainly have a certain and clear trajectory to ensure that we actually get to higher rankings because the work has been done. What is required now is to see the proof in the pudding. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for allowing me to tune in and participate virtually. I wish you a productive meeting this morning, and I send you all God's richest blessings, reminding you to please promote the vaccinate to be safe policy in Trinidad and Tobago. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Attorney General, for that very comprehensive overview of the steps being taken to place Trinidad and Tobago in a better place. And we know with great optimism that our country is on a clear trajectory to achieve improved assessments and scores in the coming years. We fully agree that on the importance of clearly knowing who stands behind cash, land, and business as a way of getting to the root of corruption. It is now my honor to invite our chair, Mr. Dion Abdul, to introduce and speak on the CPI methodology and unveil the CPI results. Mr. Dion Abdul, Chair of Trinidad and Tobago Transparency Institute.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Suzanne, and thank you, Attorney General, for the keynote address and for connecting some of the dots that some of us may not have known and some of us may have known. This morning is my pleasure to speak with you on the launch of the 2021 Corruption Perceptions Index as we look at our performance over the past year on various indices of corruption. Kanika? We are the Trinidad and Tobago Transparency Institute, the local chapter of the national and international movement, Transparency International. Our stated vision is that we work for a world in which government politics, business, civil society, and the daily lives of people are free of corruption. Advocacy, public education, and so on are tools by which we achieve our goals. Some of our key activities are listed here. This one, for example, the launch annually of our Corruption Perceptions Index, our annual anti-corruption conference, our Advocacy and Legal Advice Center, our integrity clubs in secondary schools. And even now, we are developing a toolkit for ethics in the public sector. And there are other activities we can speak of, but not today. Thank you. Kanika? The CPI. It's much talked about, some in favor, some not in favor, some accept, some don't accept. But since its inception in 1995, the Corruption Perception Index has become the leading global indicator of public sector corruption. It is compiled annually by Transparency International, using the most credible, independent, long-running corruption measures in the world. Our sources, as you will see, include well-known, renowned, long-running institutions such as the Economist Intelligence Unit, Freedom House, World Justice Project, the World Bank, and so on. This year, the index scores 180 countries and territories around the world based on the perceptions of public sector corruption. The process for calculating the CPI is regularly reviewed, audited to ensure that it is as robust and coherent as possible. How is it completed? Kanika, could you please?
The Corruption Perceptions Index, also known as the CPI, scores and ranks countries around the world based on how corrupt their public sector is perceived to be. The scores reflect the views of experts or surveys of business people, not the general public. We calculate the CPI using data from 13 different external sources. Transparency International is not involved in the production of any of these 13 datasets. Each of the 13 sources rates countries using its own scale. One source rates countries on a scale of 1 to 7, for instance, while another uses a scale of 1 to 100. As a result, direct comparison of country scores between different sources is not possible. Therefore, we transform each score from the original scale into standardized values that show the position of each country relative to others. By doing this, we are able to compare country scores across the 13 different data sources. After standardizing all scores, we then convert them into a scale from 0 to 100, which we use for the CPI. Next, we simply calculate the average of the transformed scores for each country. The average score is the CPI value for each country. For more information, please visit www.transparency.org/CPI.
Thank you, Kanika. This year's theme was corruption, human rights, and democracy. We found, based on surveys and research done, that there is a correlation between human rights abuse and corruption. And the CPI for 2021 discloses that we are at a crisis point for both. We cannot fight corruption if we don't protect human rights. We must protect human rights, we must protect our democracy. And to do that, we need to fight corruption. Next slide. As Susan mentioned earlier on, the CPI 2021 results show that the corruption worldwide remained at a standstill over the period of 10 years, with 86 countries demonstrating little to no progress. That's not good. We found as a natural correlation as well that countries which violate civil liberties consistently score lower on the CPI. We cannot be complacent. We cannot take it for granted. We must embark on a national and global fight to deal with this phenomenon. At a glance, from the top and at the bottom of this year's Corruption Perception Index, we see the normal suspects. The Nordic countries, Singapore, New Zealand, score well year after year. And Somalia, Guinea, Libya, North Korea score not so well at all year after year. This year, however, in those that score at the bottom, we find our neighbor, Venezuela, scoring just 14. At the top, it's Denmark with 88, Finland as well, and New Zealand holding hands there at the top. Scoring next would be Norway and Singapore with 85, and thereafter Switzerland, Netherlands, Luxembourg, Germany. Norway, Singapore, and Sweden are scoring the same at 85. So the same suspects that we have seen almost traditionally year to year, year from year, over the last 10 years, continue to appear, dominate the top or dominate the bottom. We need to do something if we are to change our world. Next slide. From where we sit here in the region, the Americas, as we call ourselves, which includes Latin America and the Caribbean and North America, the average score is 43 out of 100. And this is so for the third consecutive year. It seems there is some dormancy here. And what do we do about it? What is the cause of it? We see that despite extensive legislation and regional commitment, we continue to have discouraged corruption. And we need to spend some time and thought to determine what is the cause. If we are putting in the legislation, if we have the commitment, how can we move from where we are, from a stage of dormancy to one where we are actively dealing with and demonstrating on the CPI year after year that we are addressing corruption in our countries and in our region. As a very quick overview, we see over the last 10 years, only Guyana and Paraguay in our region have made any noteworthy improvements. And yet still, over the same period, three of the region's strongest democracies, United States, Chile, and Canada, with high scores, 74 and 67, still they show a decline. Democracies like the US and Canada, which are democracies of standing in the world, they show a decline. Only Uruguay remains stable. As I mentioned before, Venezuela, together with Haiti and Nicaragua in our region, scored the lowest. And in those three countries, we are said to be experiencing humanitarian crises. Jamaica, like Trinidad and Tobago, has made progress with establishment of legislation and organized crime and anti-corruption agency. And they are now seeing the fruit. And we hope to see more fruit of that action in the years to come. This is the heat map. And the hotter it is, the better it is. So you can see at a glance, the hottest in our region is Venezuela, of course. And we'll get some details on those scores in a short while. The chair of Transparency International, Delia Rubio, has said that the countries of the Americas are at a complete standstill in the fight against corruption. That we need to take decisive action to reduce the trend, to protect civil society, and to defend human rights and democracy. These are the details of our region. And we only have to look at the top, where once again, we see Barbados scoring 65 and doing very well in the region, the Caribbean region in particular, compared to the rest of us. Next in line is St. Vincent and the Grenadines, St. Lucia, Dominica, Grenada, Jamaica, and Trinidad and Tobago. As you will see, and as you are seeing, our scores have moved by 1 place from 40 last year to 41 this year. That is said to be those small changes throughout our region from 65 to 64, 59, 56 to 56, 44 to 44, 39 even to 41, or 41 to 39. They can be said to be statistically not significant. The important point to note is that even with that 1 point movement for Trinidad and Tobago, a lot more has to be done. This is a deeper look at our history over the last 10 years. And you will see, just as was mentioned by the Attorney General and by Suzanne, that we have moved some ways from where we used to be, but we need to do a lot more. We seem to heading towards a plateau again at 41, 40, 40, and 41. We need to take decisive action to move from that point, to get past the pass mark of 50 and higher. I remember one of our past years, Mr. Murray used to say, it takes, you have to make 50 marks to pass an exam. And we haven't gotten to that point yet. Exactly. With respect to our sources, there are 7 sources who have assessed or surveyed Trinidad and Tobago. And these are the Bertelsmann Foundation, the Economist Intelligence Unit Country Ratings, the Global Insights Country Risk Ratings, PRS International Country Risk Guide, the Varieties of Democracy Project, or VDEM as we know them, World Economic Forum, the EOS, the World Justice Project, Law Index, all long-standing entities doing surveys and assessment on anti-corruption and corruption in the world. The analysis of our results, and regionally and internationally, seems to point to the fact that, as we have underscored, anti-corruption efforts appear to have stagnated. We also have observed that, as mentioned before, there is that correlation between the CPI and decline in civil liberties. We need to do a lot more. Okay. What do we think? We think that to move from where we are at 41 to go higher beyond that pass mark of 50 and beyond into the areas of 80s and even 100, we need decisive action. We need effort. We need to put our shoulders to the wheel. We at Trinidad and Tobago Transparency are calling for the immediate operationalization and implementation of the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Act. We need it like yesterday. We have been in the vineyards long enough with this piece of legislation. We call, as Susan mentioned, for the reintroduction of whistleblower legislation into the Parliament for passage and implementation. We need to protect our public purse and those who tell us about it. The whistleblower legislation is a prerequisite if we are to deal with the corruption in our country. Big ticket item, campaign finance legislation. It's in the Parliament now, I understand, before the Select Committee. But it's important that we get this out of the door early, immediately, and with haste. Campaign finance legislation is a benchmark, it's threshold legislation in all the countries that we look at, even here in the Caribbean, like Jamaica, if we are to deal holistically with this corruption. Open governance partnership. We need to get back into that forum. One of the hallmarks of dealing with corruption, we say transparency. There must always and also be accountability. And disclosure of information is important. The OJP is a major step in that direction. So today we call for these 4 pieces of legislation to be dealt with immediately. What is the way forward? We need to restore and strengthen our institutions. They provide the checks, the balances on power. We need to support our institutions, our public oversight bodies, our anti-corruption agencies, our integrity commissions, and so on. The Supreme Audit Institution, SAI, they need to be independent, well-resourced, and empowered to detect and sanction wrongdoing. We need to support our institutions. They are, I repeat, checks and balances. Power. We need to combat transnational forms of corruption. It has been noted much in-depth analysis has been done. It has been noted that advanced economies play a big role in allowing transnational forms of corruption. The enablers, as we see, need to be dealt with, need to be regulated. We need to deal with systemic weaknesses that allow for cross-border corruption to go undetected or unsanctioned. Just a few weeks ago, we also in the newspapers, a report, a brilliant report in one of the newspapers, I think it was Guardian, which mentioned the work of the GFI and our own FIU here, which gave us some troubling figures. It said $3 to $7 billion of crime proceeds pass through our country annually. That has to be dealt with. We also heard from the FIB, and if I recall properly, they said that last year they dealt with 4 matters, 4 persons were charged. With respect to laundering, guess how much? $30 million. It's there in the media. We need to uphold the right to information in government spending. And I spoke to that particularly with respect to the OJP and all other forms of access to information. Maximum transparency in public spending protects lives and livelihoods. And the procurement legislation is key to that. Thank you, Felipe. As I end the presentation, I note what the Chair of Transparency International has said. All that we speak of, human rights and so on, are not simply a nice to have in the fight against corruption. We must ensure that people can speak freely and work collectively to hold power to account. It is the only sustainable route to a corruption-free society. I thank you very much for your time and attention.
Thank you very much, Chair Abdul. We now move to an open forum discussion.
I think our director, Jason, will take over the proceedings from here. Jason? As we wait for Jason to come to the table, if there are any questions or issues you wish to raise, please place it in the chat so that we can see and raise it for everyone. Okay, can I then call on our Vice Chair, Mr. Martin Farrell? Martin?
Yes, yes, Dion. I want to thank everyone who attended. I want to thank the Honorable Attorney General for giving us some hope with a very...
Ready beans, babe?
Hello?
Babe? On.
Yes, yes, hi. Yeah, I want to thank the Honorable Attorney General for giving us some hope with a very comprehensive overview of steps being taken to put TNT in a better place. But I want to thank you, Chair Dion, for reminding us of the need for the Public Procurement and Disposal of Property Act, the whistleblower legislation, and campaign finance legislation, and the open government partnership. They're very important as we want to move forward to getting Trinidad and Tobago in a better place. Our long-standing Secretary, Suzanne Gordon, I want to thank Suzanne for running a very good ship this morning. Thank you, Suzanne. And if there are no forthcoming comments or questions, which I presume everything went smoothly. Thank you, Dion and Suzanne. And I guess it was very comprehensive, the way these statistics are compiled and the launch of how this index is put together. And but I see on the chat we have two questions from Sharon Motley from the Family Planning Association. So I don't know if we can address Sharon Motley's questions, Chair.
With respect to the first part of actualization, I think, first of all, we should note that the data that went into the compilation of the CPI for 2021 will have been collated in 2020. So whatever actions we may have taken, or Jamaica may have taken in the last year, in 2021 itself, would not be reflected in CPI today. It takes time for that to be reflected, both in terms of the assessment and surveys, and in terms of the impact itself on the ground. Legislation has to be implemented, yes, and then it has to be enforced. And once the enforcement starts, then we should be seeing some impact. So I think it was useful for us to note, for me to note in particular, when the FIB of the TTPS went to press to indicate that last year 4 persons were charged for money laundering. And I think that's a step in the right direction. We have, for example, to start, well, when I say we, the judiciary, the police, all of those entities were informed and who are charged with the enforcement to look at, for example, the unexplained wealth legislation and put that, into practice where it can be. Legislation takes time to be implemented and it takes time to be enforced. To re-emphasize the point, the data collected does not reflect last year, reflects perhaps data collected in the year before into last year. With respect to the human rights improvement in Trinidad and Tobago, there's a lot of civil society bodies now that are getting excited about this area, and that we need to come together, I believe, on all fronts to ensure that civil society can impress upon the powers that be and ensure that these concerns are taken on board. Our transparency, for example, when we have our town hall meetings, we ensure that those civil society entities that deal with issues like this, issues of domestic violence and so, we give them a forum to speak one, to deliver their message, deliver their call to action. Okay, thank you, Martin.
Excellent. Thank you for that response, Chair. That very, very deep and comprehensive response. Any other, I do not see any other questions in the chat. So I will just turn over the winding up to you, Chair, and to Suzanne Gordon, Secretary.
Thank you very much, Martin, for your concluding remarks and your vote of thanks. I now invite our chair to just make some final remarks if he would wish to. And before closing off myself, I wish to thank you all for attending this morning and for supporting the push towards a less corrupt and a better perception of the public sector of a corruption-free Trinidad and Tobago. Chair Abdul.
Yeah, let me just close by re-emphasizing some of the points you mentioned today, colleagues. It's very important that going forward from where we are with a good platform at 41 to make the impact that we want, the improvements that we want, that we do a few things. And by these things I mentioned, support for our institutions. Too often we pull them down, tear them apart, and we need to provide the resources and the support for the institutions that support our democracy, our integrity, our human rights. We need to ensure that we continue to let our voices be heard for legislation, for regulations, and the like that will make a difference in our lives, the lives of our country and our region, and lead to the improvement that we want. We speak again and we endorse the call. We make our own call for the immediate operationalization and implementation of government legislation, the campaign finance legislation, the reintroduction of the civil legislation, and the work to be done on the OGP. We ask that our society, our country, our government take notice of these particular matters that need to be addressed. And although we may have a platform to start the good work on, if we don't take advantage of it, if we don't take decisive action now, we may very well find ourselves with that. Thank you, Suzanne. And have a good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us this morning.